Today we're plunging into, well, a truly fascinating and often counterintuitive field, the strategy of conflict and cooperation. Our guide for this journey is Thomas C. Schelling's groundbreaking 1960 book, The Strategy of Conflict. And we'll also touch on his insightful 1980 preface. Our mission today is really to unpack Schelling's brilliant insights, how people or groups or even nations interact when their interests are both aligned and opposed. When Schelling's book first came out, it was immediately recognized as revolutionary, praised for bringing rational analysis to the international politics of threat, or as the current term goes, of deterrence. Pretty high praise, but, well, you'll hear why it was deserved.
Absolutely. And that praise, it really holds up remarkably well, even decades later. As Schelling himself notes in his 1980 preface, the book's core theoretical ideas, they remain profoundly relevant. Yeah, sure, some of his original foreign policy examples, like, mentions of Quemoy or Khrushchev, they might feel a bit dated now, maybe even quaint. But the underlying concepts, they haven't aged a day. In fact, Schelling shares this great aha moment from John Strachey, a former British defense minister, after reading the book. Strachey confessed that before Schelling, he hadn't comprehended that an inherently non-zero-sum conflict could exist. He got that conflict and common interests could be present, sure, but he always saw them as fundamentally separate things. Schelling's work showed him that they are, in fact, aspects of an integral structure, and that foundational understanding that even in conflict there's often a shared interest. That's just crucial to grasp before we dive deeper.
Okay, so Schelling reveals this counterintuitive truth. Even in conflict, shared interests exist. But how do you act on that insight? That brings us to maybe his most revolutionary concept, gaining power by giving it up. It sounds like completely backward, doesn't it? How can you gain advantage by limiting your own choices? What's Schelling really getting at with a strategic move and this commitment problem?
It really is a paradox, isn't it? Schelling defines strategy, not in the typical military sense, but as situations where your best course of action fundamentally depends on what the other players do. A strategic move, then, is his ingenious way to influence another party's choice. It's when you deliberately affect their expectations of your future behavior. And often you do that by making a voluntary but irreversible sacrifice of freedom of choice. This is how you tackle what he calls the commitment problem. The challenge of making your promises or threats believable when maybe later it might not be in your interest to actually follow through.
Ah, okay. So you gain credibility by tying your own hands. That's a fascinating twist on power. So it's about altering the other person's calculation of what you're likely to do by literally making it impossible for yourself to do something else. Schelling has some fantastic examples, right? Can you walk us through one or two?
Absolutely. Think about that ancient English law, the one that made it a serious crime to pay tribute to coastal pirates.
Right. I remember reading about that. Seems odd at first.
Yeah, you might wonder why outlaw a way to avoid being raided. But Schelling sees it as a strategic move. It makes paying tribute non-credible. If the pirates know it's a severe crime for you to pay, they know you can't pay them. The choice to pay is removed. And so is the incentive for pirates to demand it in the first place.
Okay, that makes sense. It removed the option.
Or consider the mandatory secret ballot in political democracy. Schelling argues it's this brilliant scheme to deny the voter any means of proving which way he voted.
Oh.
By being stripped of his power to prove how he voted, as Schelling puts it, he is stripped of his power to sell his vote, because he can't credibly prove he delivered on a promise to vote a certain way.
It's all about making future options unavailable to yourself strategically to influence someone else's current decision. And this concept, it also applies really profoundly to the idea of a threat. Schelling points out that a threat of, say, all-out retaliation for maybe just a minor transgression is often self-defeating.
Seems like the biggest threat would be the best deterrent.
Well, because if the enemy is going to ignore your threat anyway, that kind of massive threat gives them every incentive to initiate his transgression with an all-out strike at us. There are no lesser options on the table. True deterrence, he explains, it's ultimately concerned with the skillful non-use of military forces. Yeah. It's about persuading a potential enemy that he should, in his own interest, avoid certain courses of activity, making your threat credible, not just, huge.
And that's where this idea of leaving the last clear chance comes in, right? You maneuver so the other party is left with the final unavoidable decision. Exactly right. Schelling illustrates this with the driver speeding up on a narrow road so he physically cannot stop, forcing the other driver to be the one to yield. A commitment, in this sense, can be a device to leave the last clear chance to decide the outcome with the other party. It dramatically shows how, as he says, bargaining strength inheres in what is weakness by other standards.
Wow. The ingenuity there is pretty striking.
It really is.
So we've seen how tying your own hands can be a strategic strength. Okay. But what about rationality in all of this? We usually assume everyone acts rationally, but Schelling, he seems to complicate that idea. He even talks about frenzy or neurotics as potential strategic advantages. That's where it gets really interesting.
Oh, he absolutely turns conventional wisdom on its head there. Schelling explains that rationality is a collection of attributes. It's not just some simple single scale. And paradoxically, he argues, it's not a universal advantage in situations of conflict to be inalienably and manifestly rational in decision and motivation.
Really? Being rational isn't always good.
Not always, strategically speaking. In fact, cultivating an inability to hear or to comprehend a threat, or maybe even developing a reputation for frenzy, that can be a genuine strategic advantage. It makes you less susceptible to threats yourself, or maybe more capable of coercing others, precisely because you're less predictable or maybe less responsive to standard incentives. He even suggests that a neurotic individual with their, inconsistent values and conflicting goals could, for some purposes, be viewed as a pair of rational entities, reaching collective decisions through a voting process that has some haphazard or random element. It forces us to really rethink what rational even means in these strategic interactions.
That's a mind-bending insight. Okay, so if strategic moves are about clear signals, often through self-constraint, what happens when clear signals just aren't possible? Schelling dives deep into situations where direct communication breaks down, but cooperation or coordination is still essential. Like, imagine you're lost in a big department store and you can't call your friend. How do you find each other? There's no plan, no way to talk.
Exactly. This leads us right into Schelling's concept of tacit coordination and focal points, which people often call Schelling points. These are solutions that might seem, arbitrary in a purely logical sense, but they're so obvious that each will be sure that the other is sure that it is obvious to both of them.
Yeah.
He tested this with a series of really fascinating experiments. For instance, if two people got lost in some big circular area and had to meet, he found that ordinary folk would naturally go to the center.
Just instinctively.
Yeah, instinctively. Or another one, he gave people $100 to divide, but they couldn't communicate. An overwhelming majority, 36 out of 41, they split it 50-50. Or he gave people a map and asked them to draw a boundary between two opposing forces without starting a clash. A really significant majority, like 14 out of 22 on one side, 14 out of 23 on the other, drew their boundaries exactly along a prominent river shown on the map. And interestingly, those who ignored the river almost always failed to coordinate their boundaries.
Wow. So these aren't really about winning in a zero-sum game way, but more about finding a mutually recognized solution, like a common mental anchor that helps expectations line up.
Precisely. It's about convergence. And this principle, it extends even to explicit bargaining, where communication is possible. Schelling noticed this tendency for outcomes to be expressed in round numbers.
Like haggling over a price.
Right. The car salesman who prices the car at, say, $2,507.63. Schelling says he's almost begging to be relieved of the $7.63 to make it a nice, neat $2,500.
I can see that.
Or the common thing of splitting the difference. He also points to the remarkable frequency with which long negotiations over complicated quantitative formulas converge ultimately on something as crudely simple as equal shares, or shares based on some previous, maybe logically irrelevant deal. Precedent, in this sense, it exercises an influence that greatly exceeds its logical importance or legal force. Think about how those Middle Eastern oil royalty agreements after World War II, how quickly they converged on a 50-50 formula.
Right, it just became the standard, the obvious point.
It became the focal point, exactly.
It's amazing how powerful these almost arbitrary distinctions can be. So, okay, beyond simple negotiation, how does this apply to broader things like social stability or conflict?
Well, tacit coordination, as Schelling points out, plays a really significant role in wider social phenomena. Take mob formation, for example. He says that it is usually the essence of mob formation that the potential members have to know not only where and when to meet, but just when to act so that they act in concert. Certain incidents can act as these coordinating signals, kind of a substitute for overt leadership, because immunity requires that all know when to act together. It's about finding that common signal when you can't explicitly plan.
So everyone knows now is the time.
Exactly. And this also sheds light on what he calls tipping phenomena, like racial segregation in housing. When residents expect an area to inevitably become occupied exclusively by one group, That sense of inevitability is a feature of convergent expectation. As he puts it, everyone expects everyone else to expect the result, and everyone is powerless to deny it. There might be no stable focal point except at the extremes, which leads to this excessively polarized behavior.
That's sobering.
It is. Schelling even suggests that some explicit policies, maybe around housing or schools, can be seen as attempts to substitute an explicit agreement for a tacit dynamic that has an undesirably extreme solution, trying to create a middle ground focal point. And then in the realm of limiting war, the logic of tacit bargaining gives us crucial insight into why clear, sort of qualitative and discrete limits are often more effective than quantitative and continuous ones.
Meaning like a clear line rather than a fuzzy one.
Exactly, like the clear distinction between using atomic versus non-atomic weapons, or providing material assistance versus actually sending troops. It's much easier for expectations to converge on a simple no gas than on some gas because, well, no size on any target is clear and unambiguous. The line is bright.
These focal points, they clearly help us navigate the everyday and even these larger social issues. But what happens when the stakes are, well, literally life and death? How do these hidden dynamics play out in the most high-stakes arena of all, war? Schelling spends a lot of time on situations like surprise attack, doesn't he?
He does, yeah. Schelling introduces the chilling concept of the reciprocal fear of surprise attack. This isn't just about one side wanting to attack. It's the fear that the other side might strike first. Maybe not out of malice, but because they fear you might strike first.
A vicious cycle of fear.
Exactly. It leads one side to think about striking first just to preempt the other, which of course just justifies the other side's initial fear. He argues this problem, though it arises in conflict, is actually logically equivalent to the problem of two or more partners who lack confidence in each other. Therefore, the primary goal for averting surprise attack, in his view, becomes the safety of weapons rather than the safety of people, focusing on making sure your retaliatory forces are invulnerable so the incentive to strike first is reduced.
And building on this, he has this incredibly counterintuitive idea. The threat that leaves something to chance. It's almost like acknowledging a lack of complete control actually gives you more influence. Is that right?
It is, paradoxical as it sounds. This is a powerful, though maybe often unrecognized, kind of deterrent. It involves deliberately generating a small but appreciable shared risk of general war that neither side can entirely control. It's not about making a deliberate decision to escalate to all-out war, but rather creating a situation where the final decision is left to chance. The adversary isn't forced to estimate, how successfully they and we can avoid precipitating war under the circumstances. This can lead to unintended behavior, and as Schelling notes, it can raise almost anyone's judgment of how much out of control the situation is. It's a truly chilling thought, but strategically it can be incredibly effective in shaping behavior.
Because nobody wants to roll those dice if they can avoid it.
Precisely. Schelling explains that a perfectly stable balance of terror, where neither side can possibly destroy the other's ability to strike back paradoxically, might enjoy increased credibility with a reduction in the vulnerability of both sides' strategic forces. This stable deterrence makes limited retaliation more credible because the fear of an immediate all-out counterstrike lessens significantly. He even frames the whole balance of terror as similarly a massive and modern version of an ancient institution, the exchange of hostages.
Wow, hostages. That's a stark comparison.
It is. You commit by putting something incredibly valuable at risk, making your deterrent threat believable.
Okay, so Schelling is clearly pushing us beyond the neat mathematical models that often define typical game theory. He seems to be saying that pure abstraction just isn't enough to understand real-world conflict and cooperation, right?
That's exactly right. Schelling states pretty clearly that while game theory has been extremely helpful in the formulation of problems and the clarification of concepts, its promise for complex international strategy remains largely unfulfilled. He argues it's been too theoretical, often failing to connect with real-world problems like deterrence. His view is that the present deficiencies are not in the mathematics, but rather that the theory of strategy has suffered from too great a willingness of social scientists to treat the subject as though it were solely a branch of mathematics.
So if it's not just about the math, what's Schelling's proposed solution? How do we move past that abstraction to really understand these interactions?
While he calls for empirical research and experimental study, he points out that in pure conflict games where interests are completely opposed, no spark of recognition needs to jump between the two players. You just play to win. But in the mixed motive games that define most real-world conflict and cooperation, that spark, that recognition is absolutely essential. He states there's no way that an analyst can reproduce the whole decision process, either introspectively or by simply laying out a set of rules. You can't just think it through alone.
You see that interaction.
Exactly. He emphasizes that it takes at least two people to test that. He even proposes experiments using devices, maybe like lie detectors, to measure recognition or excitement as players scan possible outcomes on a game board. He notes that players will often be unable to keep their attention from being drawn to particular outcomes, even unfavorable outcomes, and that a conscious effort to ignore a focal point may often enhance the focal power. Trying not to look makes it even more obvious.
Huh. So the kinds of things that determine the outcome are often what a purely abstract analysis might just treat as irrelevant detail. It's the human element, the context, the shared understanding.
Exactly. The outcome, as Schelling explains it, is ultimately determined by the expectations that each player forms of how the other will play, where each of them knows that their expectations are substantially reciprocal. It's a mutual mind-reading game. They have to somehow jointly discover and mutually agree on an outcome or an emotive play that makes the outcome clear. And this often relies heavily on what he calls connotative details, things like labels, and just a shared sense of pattern that goes way beyond the logical structure of the game itself. It's about social perception, shared intuition, maybe even culture things that pure math simply can't capture on its own.
What an incredible deep dive into Schelling's work. I feel like you now have this really powerful framework for seeing these intricate, often paradoxical strategic choices and shared vulnerabilities in everything, from huge international relations down to just everyday interactions. He brings such an incredible depth to understanding conflict, not just as a purely destructive force, but as this complex interaction filled with hidden dynamics.
And this brings us back, I think, to that fundamental truth. Knowledge is really most valuable when it's understood and applied. Schelling's work truly teaches us that critical thinking is essential in a world of information overload, and that we must always question assumptions about rationality, control, power. The true power, it seems, lies in understanding the complex interplay between these seemingly opposing forces, conflict and common interest, rationality and apparent irrationality, yielding power and actually gaining power from it.
So as you go about your day, maybe observe the hidden choreography of strategic moves and focal points around you. Where do you see people strategically limiting their own options, maybe to gain leverage? Where do you notice these tacit agreements forming without a single word being spoken? How do these hidden dynamics shape the world we live in? And perhaps, how might you use this knowledge yourself? Something to think about.